In 1930, there were 6 million farms in America. Today, that number has plummeted to 1.8 million. And now 85% of the beef in America is controlled by just 4 companies. That means fewer farmers have to produce more food, thus incentivizing them to produce a high quantity of food instead of high quality food. Plus, if something goes wrong, the 98% of us that don't grow food are at risk of starving. Yikes, that's dark. Let's go darker. A few very wealthy companies have control over all the food. And if North Korea has taught us anything, a centralized food supply can accidentally or intentionally kill a lot of people. The bottom line is this: you can't wait until hits the fan to figure out what your family's going to eat, but all hope is not lost. Here's the plan. It's called From the Farm, an industry-disrupting platform that directly connects customers and local farmers with a website that's as easy to use as Airbnb. From the Farm gives you fresher, higher quality foods, strengthens communities, and helps small farmers not only survive, but thrive. We can't do this alone. We need the strength of the American people behind us. Help us build a new food system that combines the wisdom of the past with the technology of the future. Investing in From the Farm isn't just a financial decision. It's an investment into our future, our small family farms, and our food sovereignty. Invest today.
What's up, everybody? It's been a while since we've had a podcast. I appreciate the patience and the patience with the inconsistency. Just lots of travel, trying to do a lot of things. But as you can see, I've got a guest here with me today, Hayden Ballard. Hayden, thanks for joining me, brother. I appreciate it.
Hey, absolutely. You know what? I've never seen that video before till you rolled it just there. That's a powerful little short. And honestly, it kind of wraps up a lot of the issues that really and maybe I'm jumping ahead in the conversation that really wanted me to become an attorney. So the fact I get to sit here and visit with you, good grief, between all of your advocacy work, you're From the Farm platform, this podcast, you're a busy man and you're out there, you're in the trenches and you're putting up a good fight in this, this issue that video highlighted so well. So no, I can honestly say the pleasure is mine.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And, we all have to work together if we're going to do anything. And I'm glad I can do the role that I have. That's pretty much what I've said is my job is to make a bunch of noise and then put you folks that are dealing with this on a daily basis on the platform to really tie it home for people. Because what you all do has a direct effect or what's happening to the ranchers has a direct effect on us as the consumers. And so it is all hands on deck. As you guys are going to see. I'm going to bring this up again here in a second, but if you saw this post, this is what we're discussing today. So before we jump in, Hayden, why don't you share your background, where you're from, what you do? You mentioned being an attorney, but give us some specifics so folks know what's up.
Yeah, absolutely. So the short version is, so I grew up in a little town called Fredonia, Arizona, and it's right on the Utah border, as far north as you can go and still be in the state of Arizona. And my family, we've been in northern Arizona and southern Utah since, about 1860-ish is when they first got sent down here by Brother Brigham from the Provo Valley. So we've been here a long time. And so that's home. That's where I grew up. And, that little town was built on logging, grazing, and mining. As were a lot of towns scattered across the West. Those 3 industries are kind of that was the foundation. That was the backbone that allowed these little towns to thrive out here. And so that upbringing, and we can dive into a little bit more of that, and when, I'm sure we will, but that growing up there, my family raises cattle, so we've been raising cattle. My great-great-great-grandpa homesteaded some of the original pieces of ground out there, and we're running on the same BLM grazing allotment that he started, good grief, back in 1920. Now I'm trying to remember the year on that. I'd have to go back and find patents again. But anyway, been raising cows on the same ranch for, pretty near 100 years. And so I after graduating from Fredonia High School, I went to college at Southern Utah University in Cedar City, Utah, and got my bachelor's degree in political science, and then went on to law school. I went to law school at Washburn University out in Topeka, Kansas, where I got my JD with an emphasis in natural resources law and environmental law. From there, I tell people I'm just a glutton for punishment because I kept going. I went and got my it's called an LLM. It's a Master's of Law in Agricultural and Food Law from the University of Arkansas. From there, I went and got a Master's of Science in Agroforestry from the University of Missouri. And then I was lucky enough to be able to come back home to Utah. I spent about 3.5 years employed by the state of Utah. I was an assistant attorney general, focusing on public land issues. That's all I did. And I went back into private practice about a year ago and started a little nonprofit organization where I'm still handling mostly federal land law cases and issues, a lot of regulatory law, a lot of administrative law. And then my wife and I, we raise a few cows of our own. So it's dang sure keeps me busy between the cows and the lawyer ends. So
Yeah.
yeah. But this, I mean, this ranching and agriculture, I mean, that's my passion. And I'll tell you this, if I had my druthers, honestly, I just make a living raising cows. Honestly, that's what I enjoy. It's what I enjoy doing. But I guess I realized, and this circles back to kind of my upbringing on the Arizona Strip, is I realized we didn't have any attorneys. Really, there's only a couple. I can count on one hand the number of attorneys that I would recommend to people to say, hey, if you have an issue with especially out here in the West with federal land grazing, there's only a few. And I went, you know what, we need people who understand these issues, who have dirt under their fingernails and maybe a little of branding blood on their hands, to be our advocates and our representatives. So that's anyway, so that's a little snapshot of who I am and what I do, and I guess why I do it.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that. And we're certainly grateful to have you jump in. I mean, how many guys on the ranch think I'm going to go be a lawyer and take that punishment and the years it takes to get there? And then beyond that, imagine the amount of knowledge you had to gain because of how convoluted the policies are. I can imagine how much that takes. So
yeah, well, and then those policies are ever changing. That's a shifting landscape all the time. Seems like every 4 years we got to figure out a new set of rules to live by. Because a lot of the agricultural law and a lot of the federal grazing law, it's very administrative law heavy, right? It's not laws being passed by Congress mostly per se. It's rulemaking and regulation making coming out of the agencies, and so those agencies, those personnel, every 4 years they're getting a new boss, or every 8 years they're getting a new boss, and so then we got to relearn a new set of rules to live by. So yeah, convoluted is probably the right word for that, swamp.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna play a couple videos here before we get started. But I imagine being in cattle, have you ever been late to a meeting because the cows were out, or you've had to just get a call real quick? I mean, here's what happened right before we jumped on. Hey, jump on a podcast. Neighbor's cows got out, so might be a few minutes late. See if we can get him sorted out. We got him. I won't be late. Zeus, are you excited? You want to chase the cows? He wants to chase. So we got him in, and it was good to get those in. I told him if I had my pet property fenced off, I could use their manure for a while, but it's not fenced in yet. Otherwise, I'd had them leave them because it could sure use some of that manure to fertilize my soil, because this ground hasn't had any livestock on it for a while. But so yeah,
you don't have a cow dog, you have a polar bear with you.
Yeah, that's Zeus. He's about 145 pounds, and he is no good as a livestock dog.
Yeah.
The amount of chickens we've lost while he's sleeping, if we didn't love him, he'd have a new home. So
there you go.
But and then just to catch folks up, I've been on the road quite a bit. I just got back from Tennessee, had a great visit out there. I'm going to play this video for you. A friend of mine is a musician. He does a lot of composing and stuff, but plays around with some, AI song stuff. So I sent him some lyrics, and he threw this together for us. But this is just a quick look at the trip we did out there in Tennessee, and then a ranch we visited in Montana. Just some little clips here for y'all.
This land ain't built followed by suits and ties. It's dirt-stained boots and sacrifice. Mama's garden, daddy's herd, hard truth and never spoken word. They took the food and sold us lies, wrapped it up in plastic pride. But we're taking back what's always been ours. One farm, one flame, one rising star. Shake the hand that feeds you, raise your flag and make it loud. We're taking back the table, feeding faith back to this crowd. From the farm on Ark, we're standing tall and true, with real food, real folks, and yeah, that includes you. So shake the hand that feeds you, and take your country back with every bite.
Yeah. So we just we're on a mission here, brother, and that's to help the American people understand the fight that our producers are under, and we're here to help wherever we can. I'm all hat, no cattle, but we've got somebody that's got cattle and has a hat, but I guess it's appropriate I wrap mine in tinfoil to capture some attention. So
There you go.
but,
Well, you know what? And you are good at that. You said here a few minutes ago, you know, you're just the one who's out there making noise and then trying to get folks in the right room. And you know what? We need a good midnight crier, and you're a heck of a midnight crier. So,
yeah,
you know what? And that video right there highlights it. You're out there beating the bushes and meeting with people and really from all spectrums, you know. I mean, what them guys are doing out in Tennessee is, you know, similar, and yet it's 100% different than how we have to do it out here in Utah or like up there in Montana where you just was, you know.
Yeah, 100%. And that's, you know, that's been really eye-opening for me at traveling the nation, visiting with producers, farming or ranching in different contexts throughout the country. And they each have their own needs, their own requirements. But ultimately what we're going to discuss is how federal policy isn't the way to handle that. It's trusting the farmers and ranchers who are stewarding the land, because they're boots on the ground. They know what's needed. And, you know, that's not to say that there's not, you know, continuing education isn't important as new stuff becomes available, but, you know, it is just part of what's part of what should happen. And so yeah, let's dive into this. And if you're listening, folks, later on, you can go watch some of this stuff on YouTube. This will live on YouTube, and we'll eventually get it up on some other platforms, but on YouTube, it's on From the Farm USA. And if you're watching us live, you can put comments or questions in for Hayden or myself. If you're on Instagram, I'll have to kind of look over here to the side. So it's not that I'm not paying attention. It's just I'm trying to keep up. So, but let's dive into this. So, you know, this episode's for the ranchers that are barely hanging on, the families losing land that's been theirs for generations, and for the leaders in Washington, D.C. who still have the guts to listen. Those are leaders like what we're going to discuss. Secretary Rollins, who's the head of the USDA now, and Doug Burgum, who is the head of the Department of Interior. And we're going to go through these statistics. And to your point, Hayden, you know, the ranchers are primarily in the West deal with Department of Interior, BLM, the original BLM, which is Bureau of Land Management. And so that's your public land. Everybody's familiar with this public land discussion when it was discussed to sell it off. And we're not going to go into that, but that's the ground we're talking about. And what those ranchers deal with is significantly different than somebody in the East, where they don't maybe have as vast a tracts of land, but also in some cases they have a lot more range. So they've got a lot more forage, and things are managed differently there. So,
well, and AJ, if I can just one quick point,
yeah.
You know, I was on the phone yesterday with a good friend down in New Mexico, and he runs cattle. He lives in New Mexico, and he runs cows on the New Mexico-Colorado lines, kind of splits his time in those two states. And, you know, it's interesting because I said to him, I says, you know, you go back to some of these conferences and whatnot. I was at a conference this summer, you know, in the Midwest, and you talk to guys back there who are running cattle, and they're bringing up all of these issues and all these problems that they're facing in the cattle industry. I mean, in agriculture, really, but you know, beef cows is my experience, and those are the people that I know the most. And so you talk to these guys, and it's, man, they've got all these problems, and it really is. It's a tough time to be in the industry, even though prices are high, and there's some reasons for that. Yeah. But I told this guy in New Mexico, I says, yeah, but it's hard to talk to them sometimes, because you go, yeah, they've got all these problems, but if you raise cattle in the Western United States, if you're in the 11 Western states west of the 100th meridian, you have to deal with all of those problems plus an additional layer that these federal lands bring, you know. And so it's quite the onion to start to unpeel. But anyway, I'll let you take over and let's start peeling it.
Yeah. So this message is for you folks that are the farmers and ranchers. We appreciate the work you do. And then for the leaders that are, you know, claiming to be here to make things different. And, you know, we're still waiting to see that. We're seeing some changes, but the changes that we're seeing so far aren't really peeling that onion back yet. So, you know, some will say it's just nostalgia, that we're trying to hang on to this, that the small farms decline naturally because of markets or technology. But we're going to show you the data and the timeline. And then we'll ask you guys to decide. You're the consumers, you know, what do you think from the data we put out there? So, you know, what was this really an accident, or was this by design? Now, you know, this is what I do daily. This is what you do daily. So we've got pretty strong opinions about what that is, but we're just here to share that info so you can get that in. So, you know, a rebuttal might be that, was this just a response to a crisis? Sure. But once you centralize power in agriculture, that power rarely goes away. And over time, the policies don't stay. They didn't stay about relief. They became about control. Right. And we certainly know that about the Department of the Interior, because originally they were supposed to control the land until we established states in the West. And then it was to be handed back to the states to manage. Because again, just like me making the message and then putting the rancher in front of the people to really tell what's going on, it is the folks on the ground in the state and the context and the environment that they're in. They're going to know far better than the people in DC. And once they gain that power, it's not something that anybody wants to relieve. So I'm going to throw this up while we discuss, but so let's get started. The first thing here is in 1933, that's when the USDA, and so what you're looking at here, folks, is total farms in millions. So back here in the 30s, we were over 6 million farms. And then right here, and it's kind of hard to see, this is when they started implementing federal policies for the USDA. It was right here, right before the 40s. And those two things were the Agriculture Adjustment Act. And if, just so y'all know, I'm going to post all the links to all of these things in our YouTube video, in our YouTube channel once this is over. So if you want to dive in and go do the research for yourself, you can certainly do that. We're going to talk to this at a high level. If I sat here and, you know, read these policies, you ain't sticking around. So we had,
and I wouldn't stick around.
Yeah, exactly. So we first started in 1933 with the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And really what that was, and just a real broad spectrum, is, you know, we were dealing with the Great Depression, right? So starting with the AAA, FDR's New Deal farm policy, the government began paying farmers not to grow food. That might sound helpful during the Great Depression, which that's confusing to me. I would think if people are hungry, Great Depression, you want to have food that's affordable. I don't, and you may be able to speak to that better than I, but that was why. But also it set the foundation for federal control over production. That's where it started. And it prioritized scale and monoculture, and it signaled a shift. Farming would now serve the system and not the people. So that's what happened in 1933 with the AAA. Now, rebuttal might be, was this just a response to crisis? Maybe, but once you centralize power in agriculture, that power rarely goes back, right? So you got that. And then The Taylor Grazing Act came on. So now
So hold it.
Yeah, go
just
for
a second. Yeah. And because I'd love to talk about the Taylor Grazing
Please.
Act, but
Yeah.
something that's interesting to me is, the 1930s is, you hit it on the head. You said, hey, this is where you started to see more government control and influence on the family farm, right? Because prior to the 30s, prior to the Great Depression, the farmer and the rancher was kind of this symbol of independence, right? They were the ones who were going out into the untamed, pushing further and further into the Western United States. And the family farm was, that was the American ideal, right? Especially if you ask Thomas Jefferson, that was the American ideal right there. And it was in the 30s, it was during the Great Depression that they really started to put put the clamps down on folks. And, it's interesting. So in law school, right, your first year of law school, you have to take constitutional law. And one of the early cases that you have to study as a 1L your first year was from 1942, and it was Wickard v. Filburn. And I won't bore you with too much legalese, but essentially what happened was, they actually ended up ruling the 1933 Agricultural Adjustment Act unconstitutional, because the Supreme Court came in and said, well, hold on. You've actually overstepped your bounds this time, and you're trying to regulate agriculture, which we believe is a state function, right? That's not a federal function, that's a state function, and you've exceeded your tax and spend authority that Congress has. So you've overstepped your sideboards here, so we're going to peel that one back. Congress responded, FDR through Congress in 1938 passed a second Agricultural Adjustment Act. And that law kind of did the same thing. It started putting some production controls on it. So what happened was, a guy in Ohio was raising wheat and feeding it to his own cows and consuming it for his own, making his own bread and whatnot out of it, right? And the federal government came in and said, well, we're going to pose this huge penalty on you because you've exceeded your quota. So he went to the Supreme Court on it, and the Supreme Court said, well, actually, we can do that under what's called the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, because the Commerce Clause says that Congress can regulate interstate commerce. So he goes, well, hold on, this ain't interstate commerce. I'm a farmer in Ohio, and I raise wheat for my own consumption. How in the world is that? I didn't sell anything. And they said, well, because that means you decrease the amount of wheat you would have bought on the interstate market, which means now we can regulate your farm and what you do on your farm under the Interstate Commerce Clause. Jeez. I'm glad you brought up this AAA, because that really is the first time that they really started trying to influence what happens on your family farm and ranch. And a lot of times that's how they'll do it. They'll do it through the Commerce Clause and say, well, we can regulate this because, well, what you do, even though you're not selling across state lines, it's influencing interstate commerce. And so it's sad, because starting in 1942 with that ruling is really when you started to see this, I say downward trend. I guess I'm thinking of your graph there, but I really think that's when they started to have more and more control over your operation. And then look what that graph does. So when did they challenge that AAA? What year was that? They started it, and then you said they got challenged. Do you know how long after it was implemented that they challenged it? I don't know on the 1933. I don't know, but I know they passed the second one in 1938, because the 1933 Agricultural Adjustment Act was ruled unconstitutional. So I'm sure it took them. I'm sure we could Google that, but it probably took them a couple of years to get the second iteration passed.
Yeah, and if you look, that decline happened real quick. So from you're already down. A few 100,000 producers by the time they got challenged. But then, like you said, they just found another loophole to push that through. Exactly.
And then the line just keeps on going down, because then at that point they could implement these production quotas. And so it put a cap on the market essentially. So it's funny, because they always pass these laws saying, well, this is for your own good. We're doing this to help agriculture. And yet it's like, well, then you look at the raw numbers and you go, well, were you lying about your intent, or were you just misinformed?
Yeah. Well, we're going to bring some stuff up. I think we'll find that they were lying. I mean, And you can speculate why. I mean, that was a long time ago, but there were Rockefellers and the Rothschilds have been around for a long time. So, you know, we'll just, I mean, that's why I got tinfoil hat on. I'm going to throw some stuff out and people can inform themselves. But okay. So then the Taylor Grazing Act right behind that. So they first start implementing control in the USDA side. And then you go into the Department of Interior side and the Taylor Grazing Act. Talk to us about the Taylor Grazing Act.
Yeah, so this was here in that same era, right? That 1930s era. For whatever reason, you look at history, and there seems to be periods of history, right, where there'll be, you know, you'll have 10 or 15 years where there's just massive change or massive power consolidation, right? And then you'll go a few decades and things just kind of go along, and then you'll hit another major period. And the 30s really were, this was kind of a major change in American ag. And I think we're living in one now. I think we're right in the middle of one now, and we'll see which way that goes. But yeah, the 1930s. So in 1934 is when they passed the Taylor Grazing Act. Congressman Taylor from Colorado ran it through. And essentially what it did is, prior to 1934, you had a system of grazing on the federal lands that was based more on, I don't know, call it common law or gentlemen's agreements, essentially, right? But what happened is for the, 60, not quite 70, 60, 70 years before that, when folks were coming out and homesteading the West, the way the homestead laws were written is you could only homestead 160 or 320 acres. Later, you could homestead 640 acres, but you could go in, you could homestead that small piece of ground. And if you're living east of the 100th meridian, that 160 acres, that quarter section is enough to raise a family, right? You can raise some crops, you can raise some livestock, you can have a family. But in the West, right, that's just not enough land. You know, like on the Arizona Strip in southern Utah, where I'm at, general rule of thumb is you need 64 acres per head. So it's like, yeah, so if I can homestead even 640 acres, it's like, great, I can raise 10 cows. You know, how am I supposed to make a living? Yeah. So what they did is they would homestead strategic parcels of ground around water or canyon openings. And then essentially they would control the surrounding rangeland, you know, by controlling the water that was now on their homesteaded property, right? And so then essentially there kind of just arose this system where it's like you just kind of knew, like, okay, that's the Ballard Ranch over there, that's the Johnson Ranch over there, that's the Bundy Ranch over there, whatever. And you just kind of knew that, well, they control that water, that's their range. And so in 1934, to try and kind of, and this is me summarizing 60 years of history in about 30 seconds, but essentially they said, okay, we're going to codify those boundaries, kind of what you guys have already done in the West. We're going to codify those boundaries, and we're going to create grazing allotments with that private property as the base property. And now we're going to issue leases and permits on the federal ground that surrounds you there, right? And so the Taylor Grazing Act was really the first permitting system for federal land grazing. And it's actually the same system we use today. Some of it has been repealed and some of it's been replaced, but for the most part, we still operate on BLM land under the Taylor Grazing Act. So that's kind of the short version of it. You know, and so that's in terms of, you know, our conversation as to, okay, so this is where the federal government started to kind of put their, you know, their tentacles on things. I think the Taylor Grazing Act was good. I think it brought some, I don't know what you want. Yeah, some structure and some, you know, some order to the range. But at the same time, that law even said that this system is to be in place pending its final disposal, right? Mm-hmm. So it was still the policy of the federal government to try and privatize as much as the West as possible. But while you guys are out there homesteading, we're going to put it in this system of permits and leases, you know? And so that's so that's the first time you really started to see government regulation of grazing.
Makes sense. Yeah. And, you know, I think it's important to acknowledge that there was some negative impact on the ground just because they didn't know. And so overgrazing did happen. I mean, in fact, where you're at in Burrell, we've got a desert restoration project, and we found journals from Father Escalante, the Escalante party that came up through New Mexico or through Mexico in the 1700s. And their journal actually said they've never seen more beautiful, lush grassland in all of their travels than right there in the Escalante Desert, which is what we call it now.
Yep.
And so I can see how the Taylor Grazing Act creating some structure and starting to put some knowledge there. But again, you get power, you start living on that power, and then you don't want to give it away. And then, do I believe that when it started that they had this intention long-term? Maybe, but most likely not. But once you get that momentum going and you can see the control and the power, it's easy for bad actors to come in later on and take control of those things. And so, are you familiar? So we're going to jump to 1963 in this area here, but are you familiar with anything that happened between, the 40s? I mean, let me just say this. We had World War II, right? And after World War II, I met a gentleman that had an interesting, his grandfather had an interesting an experience where after World War II, the president came to a leader in the West, a leader of part of the Mormon church, and the Mormons, settled the West. So there's a lot of reach that this gentleman had. And the president said, I want you to have your farmers start growing food for Europe, because they're going to starve if we don't. And he was nervous about that because he thought we should help them grow their own food. We shouldn't do this. And I think that he could see the potential control that would come and where it would go. And he said, I'm not going to do it unless once they're up on their feet, we pull back and we're done. And, essentially they shook on it, and then we all know how that went. It didn't continue. The U.S. continued to focus on imports or exports because they got a taste of that money. And so anything else you're familiar with that might've come up between there and the 60s that had an impact?
Oh man. And honestly, 1976, I think 1976 onward is really that's what we feel most today. And I picked that date very strategically, right? But no, there's a few other things. I think there's a few other examples that occurred either right after World War II or right before World War II. One of the other ones was actually in 1937. So again, that same 30s era, they passed what was called the Bankhead-Jones Farm Tenant Act.
Okay.
And that act was essentially, the purpose was it was supposed to help small producers get on their feet. Here's some low interest rate loans. And there was also some resettlement that was supposed to happen under this act, right? And when I say that, they called them, land utilization projects. And what it was you had all these folks that had come out, they'd settled kind of the Western plains. And again, the same homestead laws said, hey, if you're going to go homestead your 160 acres, you have to go plow it, you have to plant it, and you have to prove to us that you're farming it. You can't graze it to prove up on it. You have to farm it. So the federal government said, hey, if you want this land, you have to farm it. So they went and farmed a bunch of land in the Western plains that, it was probably better range ground than farm ground, right? But they went in, they did that, and then there was record drought, and that's where the Dust Bowl came from, right? Everyone blames the Dust Bowl on overgrazing and the greedy ranchers that went out there and just overgrazed it. It's like, it's not quite how that happened, boys. But in response to that, they passed the Bankhead-Jones Farm Tenant Act, which gave it wasn't the FSA at the time, it was the predecessor to the FSA, essentially authority to go in and acquire a lot of this land in the Western plains. And then essentially, I think they were originally supposed to redispose of it, and instead they just kept it. And that's where our national grasslands came from. So the national grasslands were created in 1960, but they were created in 1960 out of land that was acquired by the government starting in 1937. So again, to your point, once you have power, you don't want to get rid of it and you want it to increase, right? So again, now the federal government, we used to have a policy of disposing of the public domain, for starting in 1862. And then it seemed like in the 30s is when that started to shift, right? So you had the Taylor Grazing Act, you have the Bankhead-Jones Farm Tenant Act, And it's almost like this intent to start retaining or reacquiring some of the land that had already been disposed of, right? So that's a huge one. People don't realize that's where the national grasslands came from. It was failed farms from the Dust Bowl that the government went in and bought and then just kept and rebranded as national grasslands. So that's why there's public land at all, federal land, public land. It's federal land in a lot of these Midwestern states. So yeah, absolutely. You know, and then really kind of like we were talking about, you get these periods of time where you have a lot of change and then you things just kind of settle down and then you get another period of change. And I think you're kind of hinting at that, but I think kind of in the 60s and 70s is again where we start to see some more change. Yeah.
And let me just digress a little bit and explain, if you're looking at this live and you're seeing the image. So this graph, I didn't explain this brown line, you know, I referred to it as ranchers, but really it's AUMs, animal unit month. And so explain to folks what an AUM, what does that mean? And, you know, up here, we're close to 7 million AUMs. So what does that mean?
Yeah. So an AUM, so an animal unit month, is how you measure how much forage is available on the range, right? And so what that means is that's enough forage to sustain one 1,000-pound cow and her calf for 1 month. And so if you figure 1,000-pound cow, essentially the way they've done the math is they said, well, she's going to eat about 2.5% of her body weight every month, give or take. So they've standardized it across the board to say, well, 750 pounds of forage will sustain 1 cow per month. And so an AUM, so if you have a federal grazing allotment, whether it's forest or BLM, that's how you measure how many livestock you can put out there on the range for a given period of time, right? So essentially, and this is just easy Hayden Ballard math, but if I have 100 AUMs, that means I can run 100 cows for 1 month, right? Or I can run them, you know, essentially you can start to do the math on that, right? So 100 AUMs, you could run 50 cows for 2 months. Right? Yeah. And so it's just a way of measuring what's on the ground. So when we pay our grazing fees and when they dictate like how many cows can be on a certain allotment, it's the AUMs that dictate that level. Gotcha. So yeah, so that's a really interesting graph you're showing there because if we go back to so Taylor Grazing Act was passed in 1934. Yep. And your AUM line there starts at 1941-ish. Yep. So what's that? Is that 18? Is that 18 million AUMs on the ground?
Yeah, I think that's what it is. Yeah, that is what it is. 18 million.
Wow.
Yep.
And then now we're clear down here and 2025 and we're down to below 8 million.
Yeah. AUMs. And what's interesting is you look where they intersect. Now they're both at the same spot. The reduction of AUMs and the reduction of our farms they meet up right there in 2000. So
yep.
Okay, great. I appreciate
and that AUM, your line there, is that BLM and Forest Service AUMs?
Yes, BLM and Forest. Even though Forest Service is under USDA technically, it's both. Yep.
Okay. Yep.
So then we get to 1963 USDA ERS plan, and the goal was to remove 1/3 of farmers off farms. So in 1963, the USDA's own Economic Research Service proposed eliminating 1/3 of all U.S. farms. And that's not a conspiracy theory. It is in the government document. And they said, we need to move people out of agriculture to take advantage of technology and relocate labor. So now you've got the federal government working directly against the farmers for their own agenda and openly. So I think back to these farmers that were in the 60s and doing everything they could possibly do to make it work, not knowing that they were never going to succeed because the man had his thumb on them already at the federal level. And so they're spinning their wheels trying to figure out what the heck is going on. And they didn't have a choice. And so they didn't want to preserve rural communities. They wanted to dissolve them in the name of efficiency, which is what we continue to see happening. And that's not the invisible hand of the market. That's a visible boot from the federal government. Right. And so we can see, and by that time, look, we've already gone from almost 7 million farms to just above 3 million farms by 1963, by the 1960s. I mean, it just tanked quickly. Looks like between the 50s and the 60s, we had a steep decline, and then it just keeps going. So,
well, what's scary about that is you say, hey, so that they made that statement saying, hey, a third of the farms, and then you look at that line right there. So you say in 1960, you're what, 3.1, 3.2.
Yep.
And you hit 1980 and you're down to 2. What,
Yep.
3, 4?
Yeah.
So you go, hey, there's your third right there.
They
So
succeeded.
again, whether or not you're wearing a tinfoil hat, you say, well, hey, the numbers, they said they wanted the third gone. It's like, well, by Hayden Ballard's simple math, that's about a third.
Yep. Yeah. And then comes Earl Buts in 1971. Earl Buts is the guy that's famous for the get big or get out phrase, right? And as secretary, and he was the Secretary of Agriculture, and he told American farmers, get big or get out. And he meant it. Subsidies shifted towards mega operations. Corn and soy became king. Vertical integration began to dominate. So now some will say that this was just market efficiency, but why was the playing field tilted? And that's because policy made it cheaper and easier for the biggest players to grow and harder for smaller farms to survive. It wasn't innovation, it was elimination. We are seeing the exact same thing still today. The big guys, I mean, the amount of people I've met that have applied for grants, the small farms that applied for grants, just to find out big food corporations or big ag corporations were the only ones awarded these grants. And yet they've got, millions and billions of dollars to play with. And yet they're the ones receiving the federal support, and the small farms are left to essentially fend for themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I a few years ago, I did a bunch of research on the Packers and Stockyards Act. So there's another one we can throw in there, but I mean, that was from 1921. And what's interesting is that act was originally passed in response to a study done by the Federal Trade Commission in 1919. And in 1919, they said, hey, the big 5 packers own 70% of the market. So they say, hey, so 5 companies, 70% of the market, that is unacceptable. We need to break up the monopoly, and we need to promote policies that are going to help the small farmer and rancher. So it's amazing to me that we went from that approach in 1921, and then in the 30s, it's like everyone changed their mind and said, well, I don't know if I'm about that anymore. And now we're looking at this graph. And then in 1971, they just come out and flat out say, well, that's no longer our goal.
Yeah. Okay, so then in the 70s and 76, you had Earl Buts, and then in 76, you have FLPMA, Federal Land Policy and Management Act. FLPMA changed the game. It removed preference for grazing, gave courts tools to retire permits, and replaced multiple use policies with regulatory gridlock, which you're sure very familiar with. And the story is always the same: environmental concerns, endangered species, new regulations, and somehow it's always the rancher who gets pushed off the land. So talk to us a little bit about FLPMA and what you're familiar with in that.
You bet. Well, in 76 is kind of a watershed year because you had FLPMA, but you also had what was called NEPA, the National Forest Management Act, and the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. And they were passed not simultaneously, but they were both in 1976. And one of the main things that FLPMA did is it ended the United States disposal policy. So, and what that means is prior to 1976, all of the homestead laws were still on the books. You could still go out into the public domain, onto public land. And back then, prior to 1976, public land was defined as land that was available for entry and settlement, right? That was the definition of public land. So if you could go out, you could prove up on your, 640 or 320 or 160 acres. You could go out there, you could homestead it, you could privatize it, and that's yours. In 1976, they repealed all of the homestead laws, except for 2, interestingly enough. There's one, the Desert Land Act is still on the books, but that's a rabbit hole that I won't take us down. And then the Taylor Grazing Act. They left most of the Taylor Grazing Act in place, except for its disposal provisions as well. So, it reversed the disposal policy of the United States, because up till then it was, hey, let's get the American people settling the West. you can still go out there. If you're willing to put in the work, you can go privatize your piece of ground, make it your own little kingdom, you know, the American dream. 1976, that ended. And they said, nope, from now on, you retain all land, right? And so it was kind of this mindset shift, right? Because now it's no longer about helping the American farmer and rancher go out and, I don't know, carve out your own little piece of the kingdom for yourself. Now it's, now we're in charge and we're going to retain it, which means now they have to manage it, right? And so the other thing that came out of FLPMA is land use planning. That's a huge thing. Well, land use planning came with FLPMA and with NEPA, right? The National Environmental Policy Act, which was passed, now I'm trying to remember, 69 or 70.
Okay.
And anyway, and so between those two laws, now anytime you want to do anything on the federal range, anytime there's a major federal action, which these days means just about anything, building a fence, putting in a water line, building a dirt tank, putting in a drinker, anything you do to improve your range ground now has to go through a environmental analysis, and it has to be approved by land use planning. It just creates layers of red tape that make it impossible to, I shouldn't say impossible, but it's pretty impossible to properly manage your rangelands the way they should.
Yeah.
So, and NIFMA did the same thing. So FLPMA applies mostly to BLM. NIFMA did a lot of the same things for the Forest Service.
Got it. And then you also had in 1973, the Endangered Species Act, ESA. The ESA was supposed to protect animals, but groups like Western Watershed used it to sue the BLM and push livestock off the range. The real target isn't always the sage grouse, right? They used that for many years to sue the BLM, and then the rancher can't afford to battle that. And so they used that. But if you want to see sage grouse thrive, ask a rancher. Proper grazing supports the habitat, but these lawsuits aren't about conservation. They're about control. And we just, a university just recently released the data that actually managing rangeland with livestock improved the ground for the sage grouse and other species, which if you would have asked a rancher then, they would have told you that, no, this is the right way to do that, is to manage these things properly. And so that Endangered Species Act. And then you mentioned NEPA and monument expansion, which you're more familiar with NEPA than you want to be, but NEPA reviews, the reviews now delay land management for years. And I've talked to a bunch of producers where that's the biggest problem, is the gridlock in paperwork. Add in presidential monument expansion, which you've worked a lot on, and we've seen, which you've even been directly affected by, I think, on your ground and your rangeland. And now we've seen millions of acres pulled out from under the feet of producers literally overnight. So, so talk about that a little bit.
Man, that's a lot to unpack there, and I'll try not to belabor it too much. But one quick point on the Endangered Species Act is, so I grew up in Fredonia, like I said earlier, and Fredonia used to have the largest sawmill in the state of Arizona. And that got shut down back in 1995. So Kaibab Industries got shut down in 1995. There's a small sawmill still there, but they're kind of hanging on for dear life, seems like. And a lot of it has to do with policies under the Endangered Species Act, right? And the short version is, back in the 90s, they came in and said, well, we're no longer going to issue timber sale contracts because this is now Mexican spotted owl habitat, right? And I published an article on this. The University of Idaho published this here, 5 years ago. It was called Killing Kaibab Industries. And in there, I kind of outlined the fact that, well, in the 30 years since they listed the Mexican spotted owl as endangered, they have documented a grand total of 0 owls on that mountain. They haven't found one. I mean, they found other species of owls, and they have found the Mexican spotted owl living down below the rim in the Grand Canyon itself, but not on the higher elevation Kaibab Mountain. They haven't found them, and yet they killed an entire town, and the entire economy used to be based on that logging. They killed it because they said, well, this is now critical habitat, right? So we need some major reforms there, because, I mean, yes, we're here to talk about grazing, and yet all these little communities in the West, logging, grazing, and mining, those were the three sister industries that allowed these little towns to exist. And most of these little towns in the West were down to just grazing. There's a little mining, a little logging, But yeah, they went in there and killed that over that Mexican spotted owl. And, but they do the same thing for ranching, right? They do the same thing for your ranchers. And it's sad to see, because if you go Google the Dragon Bravo fire, or the Bravo Dragon fire, which is it?
Yeah. I can't remember how it's termed, but down there on the Grand Canyon.
Yep. So that fire, right, it just torched the Kaibab Lodge. And now it's up to 123,000 acres. It's now the biggest wildfire in the United States. And it's burning the exact habitat that they shut down for the Mexican spotted owl 30 years ago,
Man.
And so we've scorched we killed the town's economy. We then scorched the mountain, all in the name of saving a bird that doesn't live there. Yeah. So it's just these policies. We could go down a rabbit hole on just the ESA, but it's crazy. We need some serious reform there.
Yeah. Can you go longer than an hour? Because we're still going. So I just want to check with you if we got to rush through this or.
No, heck, I can talk.
It won't be too much longer. I just wanted to make sure. Yeah.
Well, I don't want to bore your viewers, but
no, this is good. I mean, we've got more people watching now than anything we've ever done before. So I think this is very informative. I mean, people haven't seen this map. They don't know what's happening. And so I think this is important. So, but before we move on, because I think it's important, I want to put a bullseye on Western Watershed's back. So we need to be honest about who's really behind the destruction of the West. Groups like Western Watershed aren't environmental heroes. They're weaponized nonprofits using courts to destroy ranching. They sue the BLM under the Endangered Species Act, claiming cattle threaten sage grouse or the spotted owl or the beetle, the bark beetle that has been responsible for the destruction of massive, acreages of forest land. But when the science and the ranchers on the ground all tell a different story, proper grazed land enhances habitat. It reduces invasive weeds. It builds soil, and it creates space for wildlife to thrive. These groups don't want conservation. They want removal, and ranchers can't afford to fight them in court. So they lose. Grazing permits vanish. Families are pushed off the land. If we let these tactics stand, we're not just losing cattle. We're losing the last stewards of the range. And we're going to get into the fire thing. Funny thing is I fought wildfires as a young man. It was my favorite job in the world. I was 18 years old down there in southern Utah. My first fire was on the Kaibab. And, as you come around the corner from Colorado City and you can see across the desert there to the Kaibab, we're on our way there. I'm super amped up. It's my first fire. I'm excited. And the radio's saying 5,000 acres. We come around the corner. It looked like a nuclear bomb. And I'm like, that's a 5,000 acre fire. And he goes, no, that's probably more like 25,000 acres. So, but we are going to jump into the wildfire a little bit more, but let's jump to the 80s, because the 80s was a significant time, specifically with Reagan. Reagan changed the antitrust laws in the 1980s, and that's what led to the big packers. So in 1981, Reagan redefined antitrust laws. Before then, monopolies were judged by market dominance. Afterward, the only question was, are consumer prices low? That opened the door for 4 companies to control 85% of the beef processing, and farms left with zero leverage. Now, we're talking about record beef prices in all of history. So the rule was it can't affect, what all they were concerned about, all Reagan thought was, as long as you're not going to affect the consumer prices at the end, then you guys can go ahead and do your thing. Well, that was pretty dang short-sighted, because now the consolidation, right? And so it wasn't capitalism.
We're more consolidated now than we were in 1921 when we passed the Packers and Stockyards Act.
Yep. Yeah. It wasn't capitalism. It was rigged consolidation protected by policy is what it was.
Yep.
So, all right. So take a look at this chart, AUMs and logging. We're going to get into fire. AUMs and logging. AUMs down, logging down, fires up. This isn't just about cows or trees. It's about the removal of people who know how to care for the land. You want to know what federal land policy did to the West? It made it flammable. Flammable was the right way to say that. But, looking at this graph, it's really interesting, really telling, because it's the exact opposite, right? We had 10 million AUMs or so. We had logging happening, and our wildfires were just over 7 million acres, a year. And then as we continue on with this trend, we're reducing and putting regulations on, limiting all of the things. in the AUMs in the logging, they cross in the year 2000, which was about the time I started fighting wildfires. And I remember like wildfires, we were busy, but I have a brother who's a full-time wildfire on a helicopter crew, and I was never as busy as he was. And, you know, he does that now. And so that's because he's up here, you know, beyond 2020. And so, yeah. So
well,
I know
what's wild to me about this graph right here is, so this is going back to 1985. Man, it'd be really interesting. And I know you probably don't have this data. I would love to see this to go clear back to like turn of the century. But, and the reason is because, yeah, and that's probably asking, even with you're like a tech whiz. I was born in the wrong century, but you're good at that stuff. And so the Organic Act was passed in 1897.
Okay.
Right. And the Organic Act of 1897 is what essentially, that's the genesis of our national forest system. That's what it originally allowed the President of the United States to reserve forest reserves. And that's what they were called back then. They weren't called national forests. They were called forest reservations, because what it was is they were reserving land out of the public domain. Right. We said, hey, prior to 1976, right, public land meant open for entry and settlement. So in 1897, they said, hey, we're going to take some of that out of the public domain so you can't go settle on it. And we're going to reserve it for a specific purpose, right? So those forest reservations, 1897 is when that started. Why is that important? Because the Organic Act said to be eligible as a forest reservation, there was only two things you could reserve a forest reservation for, and that was to secure a supply of timber and a continuous supply of water for the citizens surrounding that area, right? You can go read that in the Organic Act. So timber and water is what the reservations were created for, the timber reservations. And so it's interesting because you look at that graph right there and you say, so hold on, if we created these national forests to ensure a continuous supply of timber and water, right? And instead now we've reversed that. No, they're no longer good for timber and water because we're burning them to the ground, you know? And so it's just, I feel like the forest they've abandoned their original purpose and have instead adopted this, call it what you want, this environmental extremist agenda.
Yeah.
And we're now gonna use these forests for recreation and for everything else, right? It's now a preservationist attitude versus what they were originally put aside for. There was a case in 1978, went to the Supreme Court. It was United States versus New Mexico, where essentially the Supreme Court of the United States affirmed that, and they said national forests were set aside for two economic purposes: timber and water. They were not set aside as parks, and they were not set aside for aesthetic or recreational values. Now, here's another law that throws a wrench in all of this, right? The Multiple Use and Sustained Yield Act was passed in the 60s, and that's when it gave these federal agencies this multiple use standard they now had to manage for. You no longer can manage just for timber, water, grazing, but now you have to look at, recreation and wildlife and, all these other uses. And so, but the problem is in my humble opinion, that does not supplant or replace the two original purposes. And the Supreme Court in 1978 agrees with me on that. So you look at that graph right there, and it's pretty easy to see, hey, have we lost sight of what these national forests were created for? And I think the answer to that is a resounding yes. Yeah. Because if we were managing it correctly, if we were harvesting timber and we were managing it to ensure the health of our watersheds, right? Because then the secondary conversation there is they say, okay, well, they're reserved for timber and water. Who held most of the water rights? Well, the ranchers did.
Yep.
And so they have to be put to a beneficial use, which is grazing. And so we've abandoned those two key original purposes, and you watch those AUMs go down, and yet you watch the wildfire go right up. And so it's like, yep, we've adopted the environmentalist agenda of preserving these as a park, even though the Supreme Court said you're not supposed to do that. And look where that's gotten us.
Yeah, it ain't preserved. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
I
then
mean,
yeah.
the wildfires thing. I mean, it's crazy. We see every year the wildfires go nuts. And just a real quick side note, we've got all of this atmospheric aerosol spray. And I was talking to a producer that had some snow over the winter, and they sent the melted snow in for sampling. And he said there were 10 different chemicals that they found inside the snow, but he focused on one, and I don't remember the name of it, but that one chemical, they found that it is responsible for drying out foliage. And so now you've got this spray across our atmosphere, falling down on top of our trees and our the shrubs and the grasses, and it's exacerbating the drying, which typically foliage does what's called evapotranspiration. Evapotranspiration is basically the plant sweating. That's why if you're in a hot city, I remember, living in Phoenix for a little while, I'd be walking through.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, me too. So you'd be walking and it's super hot with all the pavement, all the concrete and everything. But if you walk through a park, all of a sudden you can feel the temperature drop. That's because that forage is releasing that evapotranspiration, which is actually responsible for something like 40% of our local rain cycles. So when we talk about our rain cycles being broken, it's because we no longer have the forage that we had to keep 40% of that just being its own natural reoccurring, rain cycle. Right. And so we've got this extreme drying thing that's happening, and the reduction of cattle, which is reducing the organic matter going in the soil, reducing the forage that's growing. You're reducing the logging. So now, I mean, if you go to Yellowstone is one of the most unhealthy forests I have ever seen. It's disgusting. I mean, that thing, you can barely walk through the forest there because it's so thick. And that's not a natural forest, because when saplings would grow, large ruminant animals, as they're going through there, they would either trample the saplings or eat them, and they manage that. And then if there was a fire from a lightning strike, well, it burnt what it could burn naturally, and then it put itself out. But now, like you said, we've got these mega fires. I mean, Utah a few years ago had something like a 400,000 acre fire that went through Utah, and it was just insane. And now this one on the BLM, or on the Grand Canyon, is over 100,000 acres. They just can't get ahead of it. Yeah. So,
well, and so I'm a believer in Alan Savory, and I'm sure you've read his stuff and his research,
Absolutely.
And that goes right to your point right there, right? Because, in Zimbabwe, where he did all of his research back in the 70s and 80s, he believed that, well, we just have to take the livestock off of the land and it will heal itself. And instead, what they found is they removed the livestock and the desertification increased.
Yes.
And so that's the deal, is our lands in the West, our arid environment, it's different, obviously, than the lands east of the 100th meridian, and you're going to manage those grasses differently east and west of that line. If I rest the grasses east of the 100th meridian, they're going to improve, right? And I do have to rest my grasses here, right? I do have to, rotationally graze and do it properly, right? But if I go in and graze it and I do it right, my grasses are going to be more healthy, which is going to increase the evapotranspiration like you're talking about. I'm going to increase the health of my soil. I'm going to increase my soil moisture because now there's less bare ground. And it's going to retain more of that. It's a vicious cycle, but the problem is you get a lot of these folks in these agencies, and I got to be careful here, because I have a lot of friends who work for both the forest and the BLM, and they do a great job. Right? I mean, they're excellent people, and they're dedicated to their science and their craft, and they're professionals at what they do, and they're good at it, and they're trying to do the right thing. But the problem is if you're the range conservationist, or you're the district ranger, and you're getting your directions from DC, and you want to keep your job, well, that's a tough spot to be in. Which means it's hard to implement some of these other less tried and true strategies like Alan Savory, like we're talking. It creates this atmosphere where they're unwilling to change and unwilling to try anything new. It's like, nope, we're going to go buy the book, and that's how we're going to do it, even though at the end of the day, that's probably not what's best for the land.
Yeah. Alan teaches the brittleness scale, right? The more moisture the environment has, the less brittle it is, the drier it is, the more brittle it is. And in those brittle environments, which is what he found in places like Africa and the West, the only way you put soil organic matter back into the soil is through the ruminant gut of a ruminating animal. Mm-hmm. And so you have to have you have to have heavy impact. And it's not just the rumen. They have found that the saliva from the cattle, when they're biting the forage, there's microbes that the cattle are putting in. Their hoofs are like spades, and they put these pockmarks where seeds can take hold. And then when it rains, that water sits in that pock and it germinates that seed. And when you have AUMs where you can have one cow calf per 100 acres, that's a needle in a haystack. And typically when you find them, they're they're solid hockey pucks. They didn't get broken down and absorbed into the ground. And so, it's all tied.
Oh man, exactly. And and so much of that goes back to, you brought up NEPA a little while ago, and there's so many of these federal policies that I think there are some people, when they went and implemented them, there probably was some good intentions, but there's just been so many, just the adverse effects. I won't go down the NEPA rabbit hole because you're trying to talk about wildfire, but
it's all right. Yeah. Well, we are going to backtrack just a little bit, and we're going to talk. Well, we're not going to backtrack. We're going to 2000. Mm-hmm. So now in 2000, in 2000, we passed country of origin labeling, cool, right? MCOOL, mandatory country of origin labeling, which basically finally let customers see where their meat came from. Small producers thought it would help, and it did, until Congress repealed it in 2015 under pressure from global trade partners. Now, foreign beef can be labeled product of the USA as long as it's repackaged here on the American soil. And that's not transparency. That is betrayal, right? The amount of consumers I've talked to that have no clue about this, they think when they go there and the USDA symbol says USA or product of USA, they think they're buying an American product, and they're not. Now, some will say that cool was necessary for trade harmony, but who benefits when American ranchers compete against imports with fake labels? Certainly not the farmer, and it's certainly not the consumer. Only the packers benefit. And so you can see right here in 2000, they implemented cool. By 2015, they repealed cool, and we just have this continuing downward trend on AUMs and the number of small family farms and ranches that are producing food. So, yeah.
Well, again, the big get bigger and the small go out of business. And, and the deal is some people may argue and they'll say, oh, well, MCOOL, that's a protectionist policy, right? It's not free trade, and we're all about free trade, and I guess my counter to that is, well, I don't want a government handout, and I don't want the government to create a safety net for me. I just want a level playing field. If I'm going to step onto a football field, I want to know that the rules are the same for me as it is for the guy on the other side of the line, and maybe that's a bad analogy, but you know what I mean? It's like, I don't want to favor. I just want a level playing field. And really that's what that does for us. That's what MCOOL does for us. It creates a level playing field where it allows the American consumer to hey, if they really want to go buy made in American beef, made product of the USA, they can do it, and they can do it knowing that that's who they're supporting. Because I think consumers, they would rather buy locally grown beef. I don't know how many people I talk to where it's, they want to support the American rancher, but it's like, well, if I go to the Smith's or Walmart, I just go buy my hamburger. Yeah. And it said made in America, made product of the USA. Yeah, I bought it. And turns out that steer was grown in Brazil, but it was, went through a packing plant here. So now it's product of the USA.
I remember going to the grocery store back when cool was in place, and you would see Italy or Brazil or something, a sticker on that package telling you where it came from. And if you wanted to eat that, great. But it's the informed choice is really what needs to happen, right? These label laws are just a bunch of BS, which is why from the farm, we're saying, well, let's just cut out everybody in the middle. You can go right to the farmer, shake their hand, ask them the questions that matter to you and your family the most. And now you have that full transparency, regardless of the label. So now I've heard this come up twice after I posted the graphs yesterday. And, so a couple of these people said that their, correlation doesn't equal causation. Maybe technology, urbanized, or global trade were the real culprits. But here's the truth. Those things didn't happen in a vacuum. They happened while our own government actively pushed small producers out by design, which is what we've just showed you. When every policy shift favors the few and every result is consolidation, we don't need a smoking gun. We just need accountability, right? And that's kind of where I'm at is we've got a new Secretary of USDA. We've got a new Secretary of Department of Interior. So far, we're not hearing anything that actually helps small family farms and ranches. And I think in order to do that, you have to restore integrity. And when you're out of integrity, nothing works. And the only way to restore integrity is to acknowledge that you're out of integrity. And I think it would go a long way for the people leading these groups to not take ownership because they just got there, but to acknowledge that these policies put in place are what caused the decline. Because if they can acknowledge that, then we have a place to start from. Then we can have a real discussion about what it looks like. But if they want to ignore that the policies had anything to do with this, and they keep banging the same drum that's been done since, this started in the 30s, or in the case of the, what happened in the 1800s, we're not going to get any movement. We're just going to keep hearing the same thing. And so I've said, okay, look, if we can just acknowledge that now the USDA is really only there for corporate agriculture because that's how it's been set up, then we can either start shifting policies to really benefit the small producers and bring more back. Because what we have to have, Hayden, and I think you'll agree, we have to have an agrarian movement. In other words, we need people to get back to farming. We're at a deficit, right? For the first time in history last year, we became a net food importer. And for the first time, well, not the first time, we're now at the lowest cattle number since the 50s. We've got like 89 million head of beef cattle left in our country. So the only way we get back to a nation that has food sovereignty is to increase the number of producers. But who the heck is going to get into this when they're going to just jump right into the battles that our ancestors have been dealing with and have lost? Because you're going to come right in head first into that big wall that's already there. So if we're going to change this, we have to acknowledge that first. Or under the acknowledgement, maybe there's a whole new program that gets stood up that's entirely focused. Now, I'm not a fan of adding more government and more policy. And really, somebody asked me the other day,
right,
what do you think that the government should be involved in? And I think marketing. That's it. Government should get behind promoting on a nationwide campaign, just like they did during World War II victory gardens. We need a nationwide campaign promoting sourcing direct from the producer. Because if we have that, then there's nothing that the government gains from that, which is good. The government shouldn't necessarily gain anything other than a stable nation. And the only people that will lose in that case is corporate ag, because now they're backing the small family farms and ranches, and then move these policies out of the way or pass the Prime Act so that as an adult, I have the choice and the agency to buy raw dairy, right? You've given me all the warnings. You've told me all the scary things that are out there. I'm going to go do my research, and then I'm going to choose that I want raw dairy, and I'm going to be responsible for the consequences, but it's my choice. Right. And so that's really what I think needs to happen is first acknowledge that this is where we're at because of policy, and then we can start working from there.
Yep.
So
no, I couldn't agree with you more on that. There was a guy named Ezra Taft Benson who was the Secretary of Agriculture, and he was a church leader as well, and he essentially said the proper role of government is to protect life, liberty, and property. Yeah. And if the government is doing more than that, they've exceeded their bounds. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And so I think, and so really what we're talking about here, especially when you start dealing with federal lands and federal land grazing, really that's a subset within just the ranching industry as a whole. When we start delving into that, you go, well, it kind of creates this juxtaposition. You say, well, Hayden, if your position is the government should only protect life, liberty, and property, what are you doing promoting MCOOL and protectionist policies, right? Yeah. And I guess my response is that, well, that their role is to protect private property rights. And at this point, they're only protecting the private property rights of the select few, right? And essentially, we need policies that, again, level the playing field, protect my interests as a small producer. So that way, if I want to go in there, take the risks, jump into this market, even though it makes no sense at this point, if you're a young producer trying to get in, you know, that at least I know I have a level playing field. They've now protected, you know, that ability. And then from there, if I succeed or fail, that's on me, you know. But if I don't even have that chance, how is the government protecting my life, liberty, or property at that point?
Yeah.
You know, it comes down to, you know, this was during COVID. I put out an article. It was published by Food Safety News, and I called it "We Don't Rent Pigs," and I called it that, right? So you've seen Lonesome Dove.
Yep.
So you remember, yep. So they're going to go off to Montana and they're going to go start Hat Creek Cattle Company, right? So they said, well, we need a sign. And so Gus puts on there, "We don't rent pigs." And, you know, and Captain Call kind of looks at him like, well, why'd you put that on there? And, you know, and anyway, said something to the effect of, well, we don't, so we might as well make it known, you know.
Yeah.
But it said, I used that as the title because you look to the pork industry and you look to the chicken industry, but I used the pork industry as an example. You know, the pork industry, we gripe and complain because we're 85%. The packing industry is 85% controlled by the big four in the beef industry, but pork and chicken, I mean, they consolidated it and vertically integrated it, which you already mentioned, right?
Yep.
You know, and so if I'm a producer and I want to get into the hog business, essentially I own the land, I own the feed or the barn, right? And I have to pay for all that. I got to go get a mortgage out, build the barn. I got to build it to their specs. And then the company just brings me pigs, right? And my job is just to grow those pigs. You know, I'm not an owner, you know, but it's kind of like this. Well, we don't rent pigs. We don't want to be glorified renters or glorified babysitters. We want to have a stake in it. And the cattle industry is, of those three meat industries, we're the one industry that is you still have the independent producer. But I'm afraid if we don't start implementing some changes, right, we're going to wind up just like the hog and the chicken industries.
Yep. And our, you know, these people that have been elected for these roles, they're just surrounded by lobbyists, right? And they need allies who aren't looking for favors. Really, just like you said earlier, just a fair shot. The ranchers I've met, they don't want favors. They just want you to get out of the way so they can do their dang job.
Yep.
And we want to be those allies. That's why you and I are working on some things to go hopefully get a meeting with Rollins and point some of the stuff out with the Department of Interior. But we'd like to be those allies, and we'd like to show them what's possible when we put food and freedom back in the hands of the people. That's really what we're out for. So,
yep. Well, Shad Sullivan said it best: where there's beef, there's liberty. And
yes,
I won't expand on that here because he's done podcasts on that. So go listen.
Check out Lonesome Lands. Yeah, Lonesome Lands. Shad and Jim Mundorf. They are doing a great job with Lonesome Lands. That's where I go to for a lot of the information that I am looking for, because I trust those folks. I know they're fighting the battle. They're fighting mandatory country of origin labeling. That cool. Trying to get that implemented again. They're pushing the resistance against the RFIDs, and you know they're the ones who blew the loud whistle on trying to keep the southern border closed recently with the New World screwworm. I mean, when we have cattle numbers as low as they are, that would be the worst thing for us, is to have that sucker cross the southern border. So, yeah, check out Lonesome Lands. Those guys do a fantastic job.
Yeah.
So, any last thoughts, Hayden, before we end this deal that come to mind? Anything we didn't cover that really kind of helps paint the picture for what we're dealing with here?
I guess the one parting thought that I'll leave is, there's a couple of laws that originally passed. Their intent was to ensure the stability of the livestock industry in the West, and then also the timber industry in the West, because that's the industries that kind of built the West. And without them, all these little towns go away, right? I mean, the Taylor Grazing Act and the National Forest Organic Act. And both of those laws, I think we need to get back to those. I think that their intent was good. And I think we just need to get back to implementing those as that original intent, right? because I think they've gotten buried under years and years and years of rules and regulations that, you know, slowly erode that purpose and slowly erode our ability to ranch out here in the West. And so I realize that could take us off on another hour-long discussion of what that looks like specifically.
Yeah.
But I think we just need to get back to those laws, get back to that original intent. And, I am hopeful. I think that we can, look to the future and see a future for the next generation to ranch in the West. I have one son so far, and, really I do all of this because I want him and I want his kids to be able to continue this way of life. And, I get emotional just thinking about that, because really that's why I do it. I don't do it for me. I mean, I love it. I love doing it, but man, if it was just for me, I'd just go get a job cowboying somewhere, and that's what I'd go do. I wouldn't be sitting here doing interviews or being an attorney. But you look at the future and it's like, well, that graph says, hey, this is what we've lost. And if guys like you, if guys like me, if people who are watching this don't get involved to say, you know what, like that graph, we're not at the bottom of it. If we do nothing, that graph will continue to go down until really it's just the giant corporations that do it all. And we've lost that opportunity, and I don't want to lose that opportunity. So I guess that's my parting message, is we need to get back to those two laws and, just start to look for ways to get involved in this conversation, even if it's just, I don't know, reaching out to local officials, going to your, I don't know, your town hall meetings, going to your local cattlemen meetings, whatever, and just start to have a voice, start to be involved. And I know that that's vague and you've heard that before, but I've seen it work. There's some truth to it. So if we sit back and do nothing, we know exactly where that graph is going. So,
And it does work. And I'll say in closing, I'm just like you, I'm doing this for my kids and my grandkids. I want them to have your kids and your grandkids to buy from. And if we don't do something now, that ain't going to happen. It'll be coming from a petri dish, because we just won't have it. And so, that's why we built From the Farm. From the Farm is here to decentralize the food system, so you can go right to the producer and shake their hand. And we've really put a lot of time and effort. We spent 3.5 years just asking and interviewing hundreds and hundreds of farmers and ranchers to know if this would make a difference. And before we started building it, and now we're building what they told us would help. And so that's why we're here. So folks, like Hayden was saying, your voice matters. We have seen the use of social media getting behind these policies. When you get enough Americans to back this stuff, they stop. Now they typically put it on hold, and you gotta keep your head on a swivel. You can't get complacent, because it'll sneak back in with a new name or a new agenda or whatever. But we, the people, do have the power if we can rally behind that. So shake the hand that feeds you. Go to fromthefarm.org. Go to your local farmers market. Google, for heck's sake, local beef, and you're going to find those farmers and ranchers to buy from. Beef prices are going up. A little bit of a hack for you, I guess, because I can't think of a better word. Ask your rancher for a quarter, half, or a whole, a cow share. Get that deep freeze. You can put 100 pounds in a small deep freeze that will fit in your closet in an apartment. I actually met a guy whose TV stand in his apartment was a deep freezer, because that's what he cared about that. But the reason I'm sharing that with you is you can save quite a bit of money if you buy it in a share, because you make it much easier for that rancher to get it through the slaughterhouse out the door to you. So if you're looking at beef cuts by the cut, it is going to be more, because that rancher has more handling time. They've got to put more effort into that. But if you're looking for something that's more affordable, and even a further deeper on that, ask them for their cull. Hey, do you have any cull cows? Meaning it's a cow that's done serving its purpose with whatever that was. Maybe it's maybe it's an old cow that's done having babies. Well, that beef is going to be very good for you. It's got plenty of time to put nutritional density into that meat. And now it just needs to move on to its next thing. So I appreciate everybody being here. Hayden, this has been, the most viewed podcast we've done so far. So I'm definitely going to have you back. We'll go some more rabbit holes when the time is right. But man, I really appreciate you being here, and adding your knowledge from all the research you've done in the time you've done in becoming a public lands, advocate and attorney for our producers.
Well, thank you, AJ. No, this has been a pleasure. I've enjoyed visiting with you. And you know what, like I said at the beginning, we need the good midnight crier. So you're out there doing that. So thanks for all you do.
Yeah. Thank you, brother. Appreciate your time. Have a good evening with your family, and we'll talk to you soon.
Yes,
thanks
sir.
for joining, everybody. Appreciate you. Shake the hand that feeds you. And we'll see you on the next one.
In 1930, there were 6 million farms in America. Today, that number has plummeted to 1.8 million. And now 85% of the beef in America is controlled by just 4 companies. That means fewer farmers have to produce more food, thus incentivizing them to produce a high quantity of food instead of high quality food. Plus, if something goes wrong, the 98% of us that don't grow food are at risk of starving. Yikes, that's dark. Let's go darker. A few very wealthy companies have control over all the food. And if North Korea has taught us anything, a centralized food supply can accidentally or intentionally kill a lot of people. The bottom line is this: you can't wait until hits the fan to figure out what your family's going to eat, but all hope is not lost. Here's the plan. It's called From the Farm, an industry-disrupting platform that directly connects customers and local farmers with a website that's as easy to use as Airbnb. From the Farm gives you fresher, higher quality foods, strengthens communities, and helps small farmers not only survive, but thrive. We can't do this alone. We need the strength of the American people behind us. Help us build a new food system that combines the wisdom of the past with the technology of the future. Investing in From the Farm isn't just a financial decision. It's an investment into our future, our small family farms, and our food sovereignty. Invest today.